Thanks very much. And thanks very much to everybody for turning up. The numbers are huge. It just strikes me to give you a little story Ernest Shackleton himself had about a talk which he delivered in Leith in Edinburgh. And when he went along to the hall, it had a capacity of a few hundred people, but there were 3 people in it. So he went out and asked his cabman, would he come in? The cabman said, no, I'm happier minding the horse. So he gave his talk, went home to Emily, his wife, and said to Emily, look, I just about covered the costs. And she said, well, no, you didn't, because 2 of the people that were there, I sent them along. So we don't have that problem here. Okay, so we have a lot of ground to cover, and we've a really, I hope you'll find a fascinating story to tell. And starting with that first slide, which you can see, Scott for scientific method, Amundsen for speed and efficiency, but when disaster strikes and all hope is gone, get down on your knees and pray for Shackleton. And that came from Raymond Priestley, who was one of the people behind the Scott Polar Research Institute. He was the geologist on Shackleton's Nimrod expedition. That was his introduction to the Antarctic. And then he was with Scott on the Terra Nova expedition, the one on which Scott died. And he actually would have met, unusually, he would have met Amundsen on that expedition when Scott's ship actually sighted the Fram, and they spoke to each other. So he knew what he was talking about. And I think that this is a really good summary of Ernest Shackleton, and hopefully you'll see why over the next 40 minutes. Now, second slide, hopefully. Yeah, 100 years ago, Ernest Shackleton was planning the expedition, which ultimately departed later in 1921. It was the Quest expedition. We'll call the expeditions by the names of the ships, if that's okay. It's easier to remember, I think. So the Quest expedition is what he was planning 100 years ago at this time, February. And he had sent Dr. Macklin, one of his longtime followers, to Canada to buy some dogs. He was going to pick them up in Hudson Bay, head up Baffin Bay, and over to the Beaufort Sea. As it turned out, there was a change in the whole interest in the Canadian government. They weren't interested anymore in the expeditions and supporting expeditions to their northern territories. So ultimately, Ernest Shackleton ended up switching direction and heading to the Antarctic, and we'll get to that when we get towards the end of his life. We go straight to 1874, when it all started in Kilkea House, which is opposite a castle, really, between Castledermot and Athy in County Kildare. And February the 15th, 1874, he arrived. He was the second child in the family. The family would grow to 10 children, 8 girls, 2 boys. Some of his sisters, Eleanor, who's just standing to his left there, became quite famous as a nurse and introduced sort of pediatric nursing and so on into parts of Canada. Kathleen, who's down as you look at the photograph on the bottom left, was an artist, and Frank in the front row was one of the suspects for the there's Frank, was one of the suspects for the Irish Crown Jewels, but was investigated and exonerated. Ernest Shackleton was the 5th generation of Shackletons in Ballytour. The family had come in the early 1700s as educationalists. So they set up a school in Ballytour, Abraham Shackleton, and it quickly gained international renown. It was multi-denominational and multi-gender. Students came from as far away as Norway and Jamaica. And graduates who you would know of or would have heard of would be Napper Tandy, the United Irishman, Cardinal Cullen, Ireland's first cardinal, and Edmund Burke, the politician and orator. So into that household, as I say, Ernest was born. It was Henry, his father was farming there. The Shackletons had moved from education into farming and milling, and Henry was renting the farm from the Duke of Leinster. Henrietta, his mother, was Henrietta Gavin, but she can trace her descent to Fitzmaurice's on down Cork, Kerry region. So, you know, 5th generation through his father and his mother, as far back as we can get, Irish, and born in Kilkea. The nothing particular about his upbringing there. I think a happy childhood by all accounts. And Henry then, as the family grew, 6 children arrived in Kildare, and there was a lot of land agitation and so on. So he decided to change career, and he moved the family to Marlborough Road, and he entered Trinity College to study medicine. And that he did. He graduated in 1884 and left from nearby the Maritime Museum, left from Dún Laoghaire on the Banshee, and the whole family headed to London. He set up his practice. He had looked in Dublin initially. There were no openings. He set up his practice in Sydenham in South London, and by all accounts was a very conscientious and good family doctor. Among his patients was, interestingly, I think, was Eleanor Marx, the daughter of Karl Marx, who he attended her on her death. Ernest was homeschooled until age 11, and, you know, unusually for a Victorian family, the children had quite a bit of access to their parents. You know, it wasn't all governesses and so on. The Shackletons would have been middle class, but a lot of access, and a lot of poetry and literature and so on. So one of the favorite games over meal times was Henry would quote a poem, and then there would be a competition to see who could finish it. Ernest went then, after homeschooling, he went to Furra Lodge, which was a preparatory school close by. And, you know, so there's a photograph of the students in Furra Lodge, and you see lots of faces. But I think, you know, your interest is always going to be drawn to the one with his head sticking out the window up the top, and that's Ernest Shackleton. He was apparently, you know, he made friends easily. He was good fun to be around, but not exuberant, is what someone described him. And he, you know, just a normal student life, not great at academics. And a few years later, he entered as a day pupil. He entered Dulwich College, which was the close by. Again, there made friends, and a lot of friends he would come back to them, or they would be in contact right through his life. So he made friends easily. He wasn't so interested in the academics. The general teacher report was could try harder. He was disastrous apparently at German, but good at Greek. And but apparently, yes, it was reported that if there was a scrap, he was in it. If there was a fight, he was in it. He was, you know, boxing, good at the gym, and he earned the nickname Mikey there, which again is quite interesting. He kept that throughout his life. It was sort of the pet name within the family. There was already a Paddy in the school, so that took that away from him. And I think the entertainment for Patrick's Day was to have a fight between Paddy and Mikey. Again, nothing exceptional school-wise. In fact, in a memorial notice after his death in the school magazine, it was written that, you know, the school didn't take responsibility for a lot of responsibility for his adventures and feats later in life, but they put that down to the literary background that he had access to through his family and his parents, and the fact that he was a voracious reader, again, coming out of that. So all background really was just normal for that age, and a lot of female influence, I think, as well, with 8 sisters and a devoted mother in the house. As it became obvious that academic life wasn't something he was going to follow. His parents had ambitions he might become a doctor like his father, but that wasn't going to happen. So, on an agreement, when he passed his 16th birthday, so that's 1880, he wanted to go to sea. Now, this was sort of unusual. None of the family There was no history of sailing in the Shackletons. But his father organised an apprenticeship for him on a ship sailing out of Liverpool. And he went off as an apprentice. I think the parents probably thought it was going to be a one trip wonder. Working in the merchant navy on a tall ship was tough work. Months away, lots of boredom when it was loading and unloading, and dangerous. But he turned up, and apparently his first voyage was a bit of a baptism of fire when they rounded Cape Horn in the winter, and in a storm and so on. But he dug in and survived it. The captain of the ship said he had never met anyone as sort of focused and pig-headed in his life, but he would have him back. So he ticked all the boxes maybe there, and maybe we can see the determination beginning to emerge. And I think hopefully you can see in the slide the comment from someone else with him on the trip. It was the departure from the usual type of officer. At that stage, this came from someone later in his merchant career, but it gives an idea. He would arrive along on the ship with a load of books, with his Bible, and he would disappear into his cabin reading, and then would be out, not afraid of hard work, and also able to mix with everybody and get on with everybody. So that was his north. That was his first shipping experience. He stayed with that shipping line for other voyages, which brought him around the world, including at one stage coming back with 3 baby alligators for his sisters, which he presented to them. The alligators were called Faith, Hope and Charity, and apparently they lived in the Garden Pond in Sydenham until his father got them into London Zoo. On one of those, so he moved on as he was going through his merchant career. He was doing his exams for third mate, second mate, and so on. He changed shipping lines as well. Went to the Shire line on various ships there, and then onto the Union Castle line, which was quite a prestigious line. It had the mail run to South Africa, and was also bringing soldiers to South Africa during the Boer War. He had become a master mariner, passed his exams in 1898, and he was working away here. And probably his first business venture, which was quite successful, was the book OHMS, or how to transport, or how 1,200 soldiers went to Table Bay. He wrote that with the surgeon on the ship he was on at the time. And again, Shackleton being instinctive and opportunistic. At one stage in port in South Africa, he spotted Kipling boarding another ship and sort of ran after him and asked him for an introduction. Will you write an introduction to the book? Which didn't happen in the end, but that didn't stop Ernest Shackleton. He came back home with orders from all the soldiers on aboard and others for the book. And he even had a special copy made, which he sent to Queen Victoria. On one of those trips home, one of his sisters introduced him to a friend who was a neighbour in Sydenham, Emily Dorman, and they fell in love. I suppose carrying on a romance was precarious when you were a sailor in the merchant navy. You were off for months on end, and then you were back home, as he would have been to for a few months on shore leave and so on. So, but one thing they had in common was an interest in literature, and Emily was a particular fan of Robert Browning, and she really introduced Ernest to it. And I think sort of Browning, when you look at that sort of philosopher poet type character, there's a lot of parallels between him and Ernest Shackleton, and Shackleton drew on Browning a lot in his life for particular moments and suitable quotes. Just down at the bottom, you can see the 1901 census where he filled it in, and you can see the third line down. It's filled in the Dorman household, so obviously they were courting, as we would say at the time. And there's Ernest Shackleton, a visitor, age 28, and master mariner, and he's from Ireland, Kildare. Okay. On one of his voyages with the Union Castle line to South Africa, he met Cedric Longstaff, and Cedric's father, Llewellyn Longstaff, was heavily involved in the financing of the exploration ship Discovery, and that particular expedition, the Royal Society and the Royal Geographical Society decided to get in on the act, and the interest in Antarctica, expressed their interest in Antarctica, and get down and get involved in Antarctic exploration. Antarctica, was a very, very new continent. The first confirmed footstep on Antarctica was 1895. We're talking about 1900, 1901 here. The first sort of overwintering, the first ship that was down there was around 1898, 99. So all very, very new, very exciting. The prospect of lots of minerals and so on, teeming with whales and seals, and whale oil being such an important commodity. All of the big empires started to express an interest in it, and you'd Belgian expeditions, Swedish, Japanese later, and so on. So lots of interest there, German expeditions. So Britain was getting into it, and they were building the exploration ship Discovery, particularly for an expedition. The Clements Markham in the Royal Geographical Society, they had selected Captain Scott, Robert Falcon Scott, to lead that expedition. And the idea really was it would be a Navy scientist type expedition, but Ernest Shackleton heard of it, thought this was going to be his way out of the Merchant Navy and his way of making a name for himself, and probably impressing Emily. So he applied for it, used his contacts through the Longstaff connection, and he got himself on it. So there were a few merchant seamen on it, but he was one of them. We're going to have a quick crossover to Antarctica to see where we're talking about. If you just take a look at that, you'll see where South America comes down, South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand. The two areas we're really going to talk about in the course of this talk are the Ross Sea, which you'll see down towards the bottom of Antarctica, and the Weddell Sea up at the top. The Ross Sea was the one which the British expeditions would use. They could go down to New Zealand, stock up, refuel, and so on, and then head on to Antarctica. Another piece of information to remember maybe is the distance from the coast to the South Pole is roughly 800 miles. Okay, so just if you can get that picture in your head, the Weddell Sea, the Ross Sea, and the 800 miles. So here's Discovery. Discovery actually leaving Lyttelton in New Zealand, and there's Robert Falcon Scott. The crew here, few people just to point out to you. Up top row, as you look at the photograph, third from the left is Frank Wilde, who we'll talk about later. If we come across that row of sailors, you'll see the stay wire coming down, and the person to the right, there's one person right under the stay wire. The person to the right of that again is Tom Crean, who we'll talk about as well. And down in the front row, you can see, in from the left, you can see Ernest Shackleton with his arms folded. Dr. Wilson is beside him. Captain Scott then is two over. And then if we come right across that row, you'll see two gentlemen with suits in the front row and a head between them, and with a cap, peaked cap. So that's Hartley Farrar, who was the geologist on that expedition, and he was born in Dalkey, actually, so close by the Maritime Museum. So Discovery headed down from New Zealand to Antarctica, to the Ross Sea, established their base there, built a hut. The plan was, well, the ship, what happened, the ship got frozen in, and so they would arrive down there, you know, they arrived down in what would have been the austral summer. They arrived down January, February, established their base, then they settled in for a long winter, and then they would start their sledging come October, November. So again, seasons are reversed. We're in the southern hemisphere. Shackleton was in charge of stores and provisions. He just got involved in everything, and that's the sort of the report from that time. He got involved in scientific measurements. He devised a sort of a trolley cart made out of, with wheels made out of rum barrels that could go across the snow. He was just involved in everything, a bundle of energy and sort of life and soul, as he had been described during his merchant days, getting on with everybody. So what happened on that whole expedition? Well, again, the South Polar Times, they had a printing press and they produced a book. Again, Ernest Shackleton was the editor. The photograph on your right hand side shows a balloon. They had a balloon observation, and Scott went up on the balloon. It went up a second time, and only a second time, and Ernest Shackleton was in it. He went higher than Scott, and he took the first sort of aerial photographs of the Antarctic. Down bottom left then, come that November 1902, among the expeditions that went out, Scott decided to have an expedition going towards the South Pole. They weren't too sure how far they'd get. The equipment, they were unfamiliar with the equipment and so on, and the terrain, but they were going to go possibly to get to the pole. They kept their options open. And again, he was going to go with Dr. Wilson, and Wilson said, we need a third person really in case somebody gets ill or some mishap happens. And again, Ernest Shackleton turns up as that third person. So as we look at the photograph, that's Ernest Shackleton on the left with his crest flying behind him, Robert Falcon Scott in the middle, and Dr. Wilson on the right hand side. The photograph on the right, just to put it there, is actually, we'll talk to that later. That's Shackleton being sent home as an invalid early, but we'll come to that. Scott, Wilson, and Shackleton set off hauling their sledges. They had dogs with them, but they did it was a lot of man hauling. Progressed towards the South Pole, and got sort of 350 miles along the route. And Christmas 1902 was approaching. They were on reduced rations, scurvy. They were suffering from scurvy, all of them. And here is what happened on Christmas Day 1902. And this is from Shackleton's diary. And I love the way, I don't know if you looked sort of 3 lines down, I have highlighted Bovril, chocolate and plasmon biscuit, 2 spoonfuls of jam each, grand. Love the way grand pops up there. But basically what he had done was he had put a plum pudding into one of his socks, clean sock as he says, and he cooked it up for them. And this was Christmas Day. They were only too delighted. They had creme de menthe poured over it, and they went to bed with full stomachs. As he said, we turned in really full tonight. And the reason why I bring that up there is Ernest Shackleton had thought about this months beforehand. He had packed it, he had kept it. Then he got himself into the position on Christmas Day to do the cooking, surprised them all. And while tensions had built up between the 3 of them, as you can imagine, on that expedition, this really brought them all together again, and was, a bit of cheer, a bit of motivation in something that was turning out to be a really, really tough journey. On the way back, Shackleton was suffering most from scurvy, it would appear, coughing up blood. And one night he heard Dr. Wilson talking to Scott saying, I don't think he'll survive. But he did struggle on. And they did make it back to the hut and to Discovery, where it would appear they all recovered quite quickly. when they got on the fresh food that they had there. And by fresh food, they would have been eating seal meat and so on. So later, when Scott was writing up the account, he would seem to have, emphasized Shackleton's role. He said he had to be hauled on the sleigh, that he had collapsed and so on. That's not all clear that had happened to the extent it was described, but there was a tension definitely building between Shackleton and Scott. And that came out later. Scott, a relief ship came down from New Zealand. Scott was going to stay on for another year, and a relief ship came down, and that's that photograph, if I go back in the bottom right, of Ernest Shackleton heading back on the relief ship. But not a person to, come back with what had gone wrong. The attitude was always optimistic. He came back with what had gone right. So he was the first, he was back, he was fated. He had come back from Antarctica, the sort of the big expedition that had headed down there. He gave talks on it. He was asked to advise on another Swedish expedition which had got into trouble on the Weddell Sea. He was asked to advise on searching and supplies and so on for that. He took a job as editor of a magazine for a short while, and he married Emily, and two children arrived then about, beginning the following year, with Raymond and Cecily in 1905, 1906. The slide on the left just shows that Swedish expedition. He advised on the rescue of that, and it'll be interesting because later on, when the Endurance expedition went wrong, there was something to do with that Swedish expedition which offered them a possibility. He took a job in Scotland in the Secretary of the Scottish Royal Geographical Society, where again brought all his energy to it, and boosted membership, boosted attendance at lectures, and so on. He also, when he was there, he decided after a few years in 1906, a few years in the Royal Geographical Society, the Scottish Royal Geographical Society, he stood as a Liberal Unionist candidate in Dundee, but came well down the rankings. Came, I think, 4th out of 5 or 5th out of 6 or something like that. But again, always one for the quips. When asked about his thoughts on the polls, as the polls in voting, he turned it around. That his interest really was in the South Pole. The person down in the middle is William Beardmore. William Beardmore was a shipbuilder on the Clyde, and he reputedly had the best armour plating in the business. And Ernest Shackleton got working with him. William Beardmore had bought the R.L. Johnson car company, and Shackleton was a sort of a research type character, research projects salesperson, going around meeting people and so on. And this all worked, and probably was all part of the whole piece of standing for election. It opened contacts with wealthy industrialists, because meanwhile he was planning his own expedition to Antarctica. And he announced that in early 1907, and again, with just feverish activity, got together organising it in sort of 6 months. Bought the Nimrod. William Beardmore was a major sponsor. Lord Ivy, also of the Guinness family, was another one who pitched in, and some other sort of wealthy supporters. But Nimrod was not what he had hoped for, a bigger ship. Nimrod was a 40-year-old sealing ship, but that didn't stop him or his ideas. And he got his crew together, including Frank Wilde, and Nimrod went to Cowes Week in August, where the royalty came on board and inspected it. It had a place of honour. And then he set off for New Zealand and to the Ross Sea. Now, when he had announced his Nimrod expedition, Captain Scott sort of took a bit of exception to it and told him he couldn't use that area in the Ross Sea, that really was Scott's area. So when so Captain Scott told him McMurdo Sound was out of the question, and you can see the map there. Maybe that's the Ross Sea, Ross Island, and so on, and you can see McMurdo Sound. So the Nimrod got to New Zealand, got a tow, believe it or not, got a tow to beyond the Arctic Circle to Antarctica, and to try and save. He wanted to conserve coal and fuel, and he went down the coast to where he thought he was going to be able to land, but couldn't find anywhere to land. And really, he was just aware they were burning up coal. They needed coal to heat their hut in Antarctica, and the ship was going to go back to New Zealand and come down a year later. So the ship needed enough coal to get out. Though it was a sailing ship, to navigate the way through the ice, it needed to be under steam. So you can see there in the text on the left. By the way, the picture at the top is the tow that he got down. It's the picture of the ship that's towing him from Nimrod. So, you know, that was a precarious journey in its own right. But you can see that Scott was saying that Shackleton owes him everything, and that he really shouldn't be going to McMurdo Sound. And Shackleton had agreed to that. Then when he was down there trying to find his way, it really seems to have really cut him up. He didn't want to go back on his word, but he felt he had to turn back and go to the Ross Sea area where he set up his hut. But you can just see in that he said he swept away any thoughts of the question of the pole, of the success of the expedition. He didn't want to break his word, but in the end, he ended up going back to the Ross Sea area, set up his hut. He had brought ponies down as well to do the haulage. So on that particular expedition, what happened? Well, again, he had a printing press. They produced Aurora Australis, which, if you happen to have a copy, hold on to it. There was about 100 copies produced, and it's a very collectible item. The other things that happened, really, he had brought ponies to do the haulage. He had brought a car from William Beardmore, an R.L. Johnson car. Shackleton optimistically said they could probably drive to the South Pole. That didn't happen. And again, he set off on his polar journey. And that's on the bottom left, the photograph, that's what that's about. So the four of them, Frank Wild, Dr. Marshall and James Boyd Adams, set off heading for the South Pole, quickly passed the furthest south mark, which he had established with Scott and Wilson a few years beforehand, and up the Beardmore Glacier, found his route onto the polar plateau, and was making great progress. Various pieces of bad luck. They lost a pony down a crevasse and were lucky not to lose more supplies. But the pony was a source of food as well. So the whole idea really was, as the ponies were spent, they would be shot and left to eat as food on the way back. 9th of January 1909 is what that photograph on the bottom left is. It's the flag planted at their furthest south. He knew he wouldn't get to the South Pole. He reckoned if he had 50 pounds more supplies, food, he could have. But once he got to within 100 miles, so 97 miles from the South Pole, 9th of January 1909, that was the furthest south. And again, his diary for that day is just, you know, very pragmatic. We have shot our bolt. We have done our best. He gives the longitude and latitude, which shows 97 miles to the South Pole, and homeward bound. I think it's interesting to just 3 years later, when Captain Scott arrived at the South Pole, so 97 miles further on, you know, Captain Scott's diary entry was, "Great God, this is an awful place." So I think it shows the old phrase, it's not longitude or latitude, it's attitude that'll get you get you there and get you back. The photograph on the right is 3 others from the expedition who got to, around the same time, they got to the magnetic South Pole. And that was a first. On the way back, on Shackleton's group, the 4 of them on the way back, again, it was reduced rations. They were trying to make their milestones and so on to get back. And here, I think, again, just to give you an idea of Ernest Shackleton, a diary entry from the way back. January the 31st, as we started at 7 a.m. You can see it yourself. Wilde was bad with dysentery. Frank Wilde was bad with dysentery, and that was probably from eating the pony meat. Frank Wilde, for the same day, in his diary, writes, Shackleton privately forced upon me his 1 breakfast biscuit and would have given me another tonight had I allowed him. I do not suppose that anyone else in the world can thoroughly realize how much generosity and sympathy was shown by this. I do, and I shall never forget. Thousands of pounds would not have bought that 1 biscuit. So there's the sort of the Shackleton view, and actually the view of someone who was recipient of his, you know, his caring, his focus, his observation of what was going on with everybody in his team. I think the whole thing of turning back when 97 miles from the South Pole was, again, a really pragmatic decision about his own life and the lives of his comrades. And as he explained to Emily in a letter later, he said, I thought you would prefer a live donkey than a dead lion. So just to see where he got, you can see the red track there. Well, you can see how close he was to the South Pole in 1909. The blue track, you can see the dot on it from Scott in 1902. Professor David, who was a geologist on that particular expedition, and one of the ones who got to the magnetic South Pole, along with Douglas Mawson and Dr. Mackay. Professor David was giving a talk in Adelaide a few months later after they got back, and he was asked about Ernest Shackleton, you know, where was he from? And I think you can see there, he said, as far as my own opinion goes, said Professor David, I should say that Lieutenant Shackleton is most essentially, from the crown of his head to the sole of his foot, an Irishman. He has all the best characteristics of the Irish race. So that's nice to see. He came back to a ticker tape reception. His book, Heart of the Antarctic, which he co-wrote with, was ghostwritten with Edward Saunders, a New Zealand journalist, a young New Zealand journalist, came out. The crest in the middle, I think, is just an interesting little aside. Again, you know, you don't hear much about this, but he became president of the Browning Society, the Browning Settlement in London. And the Browning Settlement was probably a bit like, for those from Dublin, Ireland, a bit like the Ivy apartments or the Ivy flats in Dublin city centre. It was part of a movement at the time, the University Extension movement, where university graduates lived with poor and unemployed, with the whole idea that all ships would rise by these people living among each other. And there would have been, you know, a sort of a credit union type operation, a creche, educational classes and so on. And he was president of that from 1909 to 1919. And again, he actually put quite a bit of effort into it, by all accounts, and himself and Emily were quite involved in it. And then we see at the bottom, Edward, the youngest child, arrived around 1911. So family growing. He also came to Ireland in 1909. He was knighted Sir Ernest Shackleton, and he gave a talk in Earlsford Terrace, nearest the South Pole, and then a little while later in the Rotunda. He also, I think, gave talks in Cork and Belfast. So, and again, typically he would give the proceeds of his talks to local charities, and in this case it was Lady Dudley's charity for district nurses. What else was happening at the time? So we're now sort of 1911, 1912. Well, Raoul Amundsen reached the South Pole in December 1911. And again, Amundsen would credit Shackleton's Nimrod expedition and the talk that Shackleton gave in Oslo as being a big inspiration and showing him it could be done in an overland expedition. 6 weeks later, in the middle photograph there, Captain Scott arrived at the South Pole with 5 others, and all perished on the return journey. And then down the bottom is the Titanic, which sank in April 1912. And Ernest Shackleton turned up at the Board of Trade inquiry as a sort of an expert witness on ships and ice. And his evidence there, his testimony, is again shows somebody who really knew about how a ship operated, really knew what a captain of a ship, the pressure he would be under if the owner of the shipping line was aboard, but also knew that if you put one person up in the crow's nest for a long period, they're going to get frozen and they're going to get bored. So he knew what it was like, you know, in all parts of the ship, and his testimony was very strong and forthright. He was giving talks again around the world on the Nimrod expedition. He was in huge demand still, and most of the heads of state in Europe he spoke to, and he also toured the States. And here's a photograph of him in 1913 in the States, with Raoul Amundsen and Shackleton in the middle, and Robert Peary on the right, Peary being the first to the North Pole in 1909. So he was really in among the big ones. He was well regarded, and you can see when Amundsen came to London to give his talk, as was the thing to do, Shackleton, a lot of the exploration establishment in Britain wouldn't turn up. They had sort of some idea, apparently, that you know, Amundsen, that really the pole was Scots, and Amundsen maybe had cheated a little using dogs and so on. But Shackleton turned up, and in that sense, he was always outside of the establishment. And I think Jonathan Shackleton and John McKenna in their book, An Irishman in Antarctica, make a strong argument. He was an outsider, and he wasn't part of the establishment. And you can see he wrote to the papers. He said when Amundsen had got to the South Pole, he wrote that the same endurance, the same skill, the same meed of endeavour should be granted to Amundsen as the Norwegian people would grant to Scott if the positions were reversed. Kathleen Scott didn't like his support of Amundsen, and she said about Shackleton that she would willingly assist in that man's assassination. Okay, he was again feeling a bit of a floating gent, he was called at the time, and he felt there was one more big thing to be done in the Antarctic, and that was to cross the continent from sea to sea. And he set about organising an expedition to do that. Meanwhile, he wrote in now the date on the photograph's 1922, but it was reprinted in 1922 actually. In 1914, he wrote about the requirements that you need to go through this world successfully, and you can see optimism, patience, idealism, and courage in that order. So you can see courage sort of is the last one. The other ones are in the head, in the mind, motivational, and you know, so on. And just again, on the Shackleton Museum website, we've made a very successful series of podcasts around this. We've made them with Juliana Edelman from DCU. And it's really about these qualities in our current pandemic. You know, if they were good enough for Shackleton, maybe they could be of use to us. As I say, he was planning his next expedition, the last great thing which he felt needed to be done, which was to cross the Antarctic from sea to sea. And the plan was one ship with Shackleton and a crew on board would come into the Weddell Sea, that's up at the top left of Antarctica, as you see it on the map, and they would cross via the pole. Another ship would have come into the Ross Sea area, would have laid depots up towards the South Pole, up the Beardmore Glacier, and the crew coming over from the Weddell Sea would pick up these depots as they came down and complete the crossing. So the Endurance was the ship going to come into the Weddell Sea. The Aurora came into the Ross Sea. The Aurora story is a different story, so we won't go into it now. But let's look at the Endurance. So here's Endurance. Endurance, he bought it in Norway. It was an ice strengthened ship, and yes, and he was a celebrity at this stage. Ernest Shackleton was. Over 5,000 applied to go on it. His way of selecting the crew was too unconventional, to say the least. He picked Leonard Hussey because he thought he looked funny. But a lot of the old hands came as well. Tom Crean, Frank Wilde, and so on showed up. And here's Endurance. Actually, I think this photograph is leaving Buenos Aires. It departed London. Interestingly, it left the Thames on the 1st of August, 1914, called into some ports on the west coast, on the south coast of England on the 4th of August, saw that the mobilization was going to be announced as Britain entered the war. And he telegraphed the Admiralty, what should he do? And the reply was proceed, which came from Winston Churchill, who was the first Sea Lord at the time. So, as I say, Endurance set off down Buenos Aires, and then on to South Georgia, where South Georgia is an island, an Antarctic island. There was a Norwegian whaling station there, and he was going to get final supplies and head into the Antarctic. 3 days out of Buenos Aires, an unexpected crew member emerged. Percy Blackborough was a stowaway, and then Shackleton apparently just sort of lost it, railed around the ship, railed in front of him, gave out. But really the whole idea was to get the two who had facilitated on board to get out, to find out who had done this. He thought he knew everybody in the crew. He hadn't expected this to happen. So they came forward, and for the rest of the trip, Percy Blackborough was treated as one of the crew. In fact, Shackleton, 2 generations later, his grandchildren would say that Shackleton was really influential in Percy Blackborough's life, and encouraging him to go and do things and so on, and allowing him to do things that maybe he wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. But I mean, what a precarious life to be a stowaway on Endurance and find you're aboard it. The picture at the bottom shows Endurance at Grytviken in South Georgia. You can see Endurance in the middle of the harbour. So they called to South Georgia, spent a bit of time there replenishing supplies and so on, and then headed into the Antarctic. So December 1914, left South Georgia heading for the Antarctic. And really the story here is, I think, sort of to show you some of the bits in the photographs. And again, remember, these photographs were taken when you listen to the rest of the story. A lot of them were glass plates and so on. And the fact that we're able to look at them now, I think, is nothing short of amazing. There's Tom Crean with the pups that were born on board. A beautiful sort of, winter night shot of Endurance. Frank Hurley, the photographer, was really an amazing artist. The top right shows, again, Shackleton's idea that, as he said, he wanted the BAs working with the ABs. So the BAs from Cambridge and Oxford would work with the able-bodied seamen. Everyone was equal. Everyone had to take part in the different jobs on the ship and on land. So the seamen would help the scientists and so on. So that photograph, actually, Dr. Macklin is in there, and Alf Cheetham, who was the 3rd officer. Bottom left, Shackleton wasn't behind the door. He was quite happy to have a joke made of himself and so on. So he was first to get the haircut as the ship froze in over the winter. So really, they encountered ice in February 1915. The ship got frozen in, and really they were locked in that ice as the austral winter approached. And it all seemed things would work out, would be okay. Again, constant entertainment going on, sort of exercising the dogs, exercising the crew, and everyone was really working in this together. And then slowly over the months, July, August, September, the ice started to pack up on the ship, exert huge pressure on it, warp it out of shape. And so the picture of the abandoned ship, they had to abandon ship. The ship was just warped and crushed, and they moved onto the ice. So what do you do when you move onto the ice with 27 others? Well, Shackleton gathered them around. Ships and stores are gone. We're going home. And there's that Frank Hurley photograph again, I think, of the dogs looking at the ship. That's about October 1915. Nobody knows where you are. Nobody is going to come and find you. You have no way of communicating with the outside world. What do you do? And so again, Ernest Shackleton, you know, not one to shirk responsibility, moved in. This is where he was at his best. Took the leadership role. They camped on the ice, established a series of different camps. You know, each person was allowed to take minimal possessions from the wreck of the ship. He encouraged letters from home and photographs. He also insisted Leonard Hussey take the banjo as vital mental medicine for the crew over the coming months. They were camped on, you know, a big ice sheet. Gradually, there was a theory that there was a sort of a clockwise movement of ice in the Weddell Sea, and really, this is what he thought would happen. They did try the Paulet Island, which had been crucial in the Swedish expedition, which he advised on. He knew there was stores on Paulet Island in the Weddell Sea. It was 340 miles away. They did try hauling the lifeboats, but really they could only make slow progress. They weren't going to get there. And then through their observations, they were able to see the ice was drifting in that circular movement. So if they stayed where they were, they would eventually drift out as the ice broke up and into the open sea. And then, you know, they would take it from there, I suppose. And you can see the different camps. Dump camp was when they dumped everything out of the ship, got themselves together. Ocean camp, as the ice started to break up into, you know, a piece a few hectares in size, and it was drifting along. And finally, patience camp, which was, as he described it, put the boot of action into the stirrup of patience. So that was it, really. The ice drifted right through those months, November, December. Meanwhile, he suspected they were going to need a boat journey to establish contact with the outside world. And along the way, he had Harry McNish, the carpenter, raise the sides of the James Caird, the biggest lifeboat they had. They had to keep the lifeboats with them. It was a catch-22. The lifeboats prevented them from marching across the ice, and the risk of the ice breaking up was too much to ignore the lifeboats. So they kept them with them. And, you know, Shackleton was this motivating, energetic, you know, observing everything that went on sort of person, talking to everybody, leading from the front. They drifted right through, you know, right through the end of the year on the ice. March, the ice was breaking up and getting very, very weak and rotten as they were drifting out into the open sea. So they were forced to, in April 1916, they took to the lifeboats. Different options were ruled themselves out. They thought they might get to various islands, and, you know, currents or wind kept them off it. And eventually, they made landfall on a bleak frozen rock called Elephant Island. Nobody had landed on it before, and as the James Caird with Shackleton aboard beached, he carried Percy Blackborough, the stowaway, who was at this stage suffering from frostbite, carried him above the high water line so that he could be the first person to land on Elephant Island. But that boat journey from the ice to Elephant Island was horrific, about 6 days in open boats, when they were really pushed and people were pushed to the, you know, the limits of their endurance. The austral winter was coming at that stage in April, so there was a short window to maybe try and make contact with the outside world. He picked a crew of 5 others, and there's Frank Worsley, who was a navigator and sailor, amazing. Tom Crean, who we know of. Then moving to the bottom row, Harry McNish, the carpenter, Tim McCarthy from Kinsale, and John Vincent, who was a trawlerman from Hull and physically very strong. And again, lots of debate about why he picked them. The piece for me that comes out is half the crew were Irish, and definitely Crean and McCarthy were, you know, hard-working optimists, who I think, and great sailors who you would want on board with you. Frank Worsley, the amazing navigator. So Easter Monday 1916, the James Caird departed Elephant Island with, you know, to try and make contact with the outside world. A 22-foot boat pitched against the Southern Ocean south of Cape Horn. They made good progress, but it was a horrendous voyage. 4 hours on, 4 hours off. 3 of them on each watch. One steering, one with the sails, the other bailing the boat all the time. Ice was forming on the boat and weighing it down, and they would try and chip that off with the carpenter's axe. And then, you know, they just met, you know, 60-foot waves and so on, and just horrendous conditions. And, you know, probably one of the greatest feats of, well, without doubt, one of the greatest feats of seafaring. 14 days later, they sighted South Georgia. And if you just take a look at the map on the left, you can see the blue track is the track of the James Caird. And they actually headed off north in the first few days. The wind conditions were favourable. They thought they might get to the Falklands. They knew that the Cape Horn was out of the question just due to currents and so on. But then as conditions changed, they changed course to South Georgia, which was again a voyage of 800 miles. On day 14 on this boat, just as their water was running low and so on, one of the barrels had been broached, had been contaminated. They sighted South Georgia, but then a gale blew up, and really for 2 days they held off, which must have been just incredible. Again, seamanship. Reports are that, you know, when waves hit the boat was so spent at this stage, you know, that the planks on the side of it, they were filtering the water through. The water would come in. But again, storm died down, and they surfed into King Haakon Bay, set up camp, and were able to get albatross eggs and albatross chicks and so on, and build up their strength. But now they had to get to the whaling station, which was on the other side of the island. So having spent a few days there building up their strength and waiting for weather conditions to sort of look promising, a full moon and so on, Shackleton, Tom Crean and Worsley set off to cross South Georgia. It was a 36-hour march, with, again, you know, over mountain peaks and so on, across glaciers. And on the 20th of May, Ernest Shackleton thought he heard the whistle from the whaling station. And so it was. A few miles later, they could look down from a sort of a cliff, and they could see the whaling station below them. They made their way down. They crossed over, and just a quick idea maybe of how he describes it. They had to climb down a waterfall, and they were heading for the whaling station. Shackleton says, "That was all except our wet clothes that we brought out of the Antarctic, which we had entered a year and a half before with a well-found ship, full equipment and high hopes. That was all of tangible things, but in memories we were rich. We had pierced the veneer of outside things. We had suffered, starved and triumphed, grovelled down, yet grasped at glory, grown bigger in the bigness of the whole. We had seen God in his splendours, heard the text that nature renders. We had reached the naked soul of man." And that's really powerful writing. It does paraphrase Robert Service's poem, The Call of the Wild, but Shackleton was well able to express himself. They arrived at the whaling station. And there's Tom Crean, Ernest Shackleton, and Frank Worsley after a clean up and a shave. Unfortunately, no photographs were taken. They initially came down. They must have looked like something else. They frightened children in the area when they arrived. But quickly, he got together to retrieve the 3 others who had been left on the other side of Elephant Island, of South Georgia. So to retrieve them and the James Caird, the lifeboat, the Norwegian sailors insisted that that lifeboat should be preserved. No one could have made that voyage. And the James Caird, it still exists in Dulwich College, if anyone is ever over that direction in London. And lo and behold, the ones on Elephant Island who at this stage were living under the 2 other lifeboats, which had been turned upside down and form a hut, spotted this ship on the horizon. The ice had miraculously cleared from around Elephant Island, and the boat was lowered and rowed in. Shackleton sitting up in the boat with Frank Worsley and Tom Crean, counting them as they ran down to the shore. 19, 20, 21, 22, they're all alive, Frank. I would have felt like murder if anyone had died. They quickly evacuated Elephant Island and came back to huge claim in Chile. Meanwhile, the expedition which had gone to the Ross Sea had ran into difficulties. As I say, that's another story, but basically there was a ship in New Zealand which needed to go down to rescue the crew in the Ross Sea. And Ernest Shackleton quickly found his way from Chile to New Zealand, and in December set off aboard Aurora to recover, retrieve the men from the other side, from the Ross Sea. Which he did. They were amazed to see him coming by ship. They thought he would arrive over the South Pole, but anyway, this is how he retrieved them. He came back to Britain. He was sort of sent back to Chile on a sort of a propaganda mission, really, with World War I still raging, and back again after the end of the war, where he was sent up to Murmansk. There was an expeditionary force in Murmansk, continuing a sort of a battle with the supporting the White Russians against the Reds, and he was sent up there really because of his expertise with cold conditions, and he was in charge of supplies and equipment. But he felt it wasn't for him up there, and as he wrote to Emily, he felt useless unless he was battling the elements somewhere in a remote place. But back to London, and he gave lectures and talks on his endurance expedition. I mean, a series 5 months of 2 lectures a day in the Philharmonic Hall. But really, after the trauma of the war, people weren't interested in the aftermath of the endurance expedition. You can see, sorry, the postcard there is to Cecily, his daughter, from Mikey, April 1918. So he wanted one more try at the Antarctic, a fairly undefined expedition, and we're back to where I started. Sorry, he initially was going to go to the Arctic and switch to the Antarctic. One of his old school friends, John Quiller Rowett, financed the expedition, and he bought the ship, the Quest. And about September 1921, Quest headed for Antarctica. He ran a competition. 2 Boy Scouts were selected to go on board. One had to come back from Lisbon. He was suffering from seasickness. If ever, that photograph on the bottom right, if ever I wanted to be a fly on the wall in a conversation, or whatever the marine equivalent is, there's Frank Wilde talking to Ernest Shackleton as the Quest sails along. Love to know what they say. And the photograph on the top right, I'm showing you it because the cabin behind Ernest Shackleton is the cabin in which he died, which I'll talk about in a moment. Quest got to Buenos Aires, headed on to South Georgia. South Georgia brought back memories of Ernest Shackleton, of the endurance expedition, where he had reached to organise the rescue and so on. About the 3rd of January, 4th of January, it arrived in Grytviken harbour. and Shackleton went ashore and met with some of the Norwegian sealers and sailors who knew him and so on from before. Came back aboard Quest. His diary entry there, 4th of January, at last, after 16 days of turmoil and anxiety and so on, we have come to anchor in Grytviken. You know, now we must, how familiar the coast seemed as we passed down. We saw with full interest places we struggled over after the boat journey. And then a wonderful evening, in the darkening twilight, I saw a lone star hover, gem-like, above the bay. Later that night, Dr. Macklin got a call from Ernest Shackleton's cabin. He had pains in his back and neuralgia in his face and so on. He prescribed medication, told him he was living life at too hard a rate. He should really slow down and so on. And then in the early hours of January the 5th, he was called to the cabin again, and Ernest Shackleton had a heart attack and died. The Quest expedition continued. Leonard Hussey stayed ashore and accompanied the body back to Uruguay, where they were going to ship it back to Britain. They contacted Lady Shackleton. Emily said, no, he really should be buried in South Georgia. His heart should lie in the Antarctic. And so the body was brought back to South Georgia. And
the night Shackleton died, I was on watch. As I came off watch, passing his cabin, he called out to me. He said, Huss, I can't sleep. Play me some of the old tunes, will you? They always help me to sleep. So I played him a lullaby.
to hear that, and that was Leonard Hussey playing the banjo from the Endurance, which he had played to Ernest Shackleton the night that he died. And in an interview, I think in the 40s or 50s, Leonard Hussey spoke about the night Shackleton died. The body was brought back, as I say, to South Georgia, where it was buried in the Sealers Cemetery in South Georgia. A nice touch, rather than the Christian face the grave east-west. His colleagues decided to bury him north-south, so as his heart would be that little bit closer to the South Pole, which he had so strived to attain. The inscription on the gravestone, which was put up a few years later, is again very fitting from Robert Browning. I hold that a man should strive to the uttermost for life's set prize. So here I think it's just, as we come to the finish, a nice photograph of Ernest Shackleton waving goodbye on the Quest. I'm not going to, at this hour, get into his legacy, but maybe I think the optimism, patience, courage and idealism are good points to remember from someone who knew all about it. And I think also, if we were to put Raymond Priestley's summary into maybe more modern parlance, maybe we could say something like that, you know, in times of strife, when the odds are against you, maybe you need to look for that inner Shackleton to get you through. I hope this talk has helped fill out a bit of Ernest Shackleton's life, an amazing life. I just want to show you the Shackleton Museum in Athy. Very briefly, we run the Shackleton Autumn School. This year it was virtual. We have a really beautiful statue of Ernest Shackleton, the second only statue to him in a public place, and definitely the most accessible one, by Mark Richards. It actually featured in the Sunday Times last Sunday, as it happens. We have a mock-up of the James Caird with 3 ghostly figures on board, which we bring to different maritime places around. A student project, the Shackleton Challenge, which is about teamwork and delivering a project. Bottom left is the cabin in which he died, which in 2015 we got from the very north of Norway, where it had been preserved. And at the moment that is undergoing conservation. And the Shackleton Museum, which we have advanced plans to develop, it will be an amazing exhibit in that. We also produce a journal, the Nimrod Journal, and various other. Shackleton's Endurance is a CD and music which describes the endurance expedition. So right, I hope that's all held together somewhat, and I'll just unshare my screen and we'll see what happens next. Okay, thank you.